Welcome to AsiaEit et al., the podcast that brings you research publishing tips direct from industry experts. I'm your host, Trevor Lane. Hello. In today's podcast, we'll talk about something we all come across when reading the research literature but may not fully appreciate. It's a code of numbers and letters called a Digital Object Identifier, or DOI. Helping us understand what DOIs are, how they work, and why we need them is Rachael Lammey from Crossref, a non-profit DOI registration agency. We also discuss Crossref's similarity check service, which journals use to detect possible plagiarism in submitted manuscripts. As we'll hear, Crossref has a very important role behind the scenes in academic publishing around the world. So I'd like to welcome our guest, Rachael Lammey, Crossref's head of special programs, who also works in member and community outreach.
Hi, Rachael. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Trevor. No, thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Now, some of our audience may not have heard of Crossref, but they would have seen a DOI, or Digital Object Identifier, in a reference or a footnote in a journal article. Did Crossref invent the DOI, and when and why?
So, Crossref, we didn't invent the DOI. It predates us a little bit. So the DOI system was an initiative between three trade associations in the publishing industry. They launched the DOI system in 1997 at the Frankfurt Book Fair. And at the same time, they established what's called the International DOI Foundation, or IDF. And it creates and manages the DOI system. So as Crossref, the IDF are kind of in charge of the DOIs, but we're what's called a registration agency. So we're allowed to register on behalf of our members.
Okay, so how did Crossref form?
So when publishers started to publish online, they were finding that links to content would break over time and that people couldn't navigate between research. So it was a group of, I think it was initially 8 publishers who got together and decided to found Crossref in the year 2000. So they decided to have one organisation for the publishing industry to provide identifiers and register the content. Certainly made a lot more sense than each publisher doing it individually.
So the DOI is the persistent identifier, so it's a permanent ID code. And it's better than a URL web link, which is unstable, especially if a website gets redesigned. But how does the DOI actually link someone to the actual article?
It's all down to the metadata that the publisher registers with us. So when a publisher publishes a journal article, they send Crossref information about the article, things like the title, the names of the authors. And a key piece to that is also the URL or the website where the article is located. And they also provide the DOI for that article, or they build one for that article. So in the information that we have kind of behind the scenes, we tie the DOI to the URL on the publisher website where the content's located.
So the authors don't obtain the DOI themselves. The journal applies for the DOIs if it's a Crossref member, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. So the journal it tends to be the publisher of the journal or the Crossref member. And that's because they're sort of the authority on where the content is located. And if that content moves over time to maybe a new publisher or a new URL, then you have that authoritative source of information. So a journal or a publisher would come back to us and update the URL that's associated with that DOI over time so that the link is persistent in a way that an author or one individual might not be able to maintain the same information.
Oh, okay. So thanks to DOIs, the article can always be found and could also be backed up and permanently archived. How do journals do that? Do they have to do an extra archiving step?
So at Crossref, we archive the metadata that the publishers register with us. I think we do that with Clocks, who are an archiving service, and with Portico. So even if a journal disappears from the web, we'll still have metadata related to the publications that were connected to that journal. But the other thing that we can do for publishers is that if publishers have an agreement with some of those archiving services for their content, if that publisher stops publishing or they stop publishing a journal, at Crossref, we can trigger that archiving or that redirection to the archiving service. So we can kind of play a role in making sure that not just the metadata, but also the content is discoverable in the long term, even if the publication goes away.
Oh, wow, that's a really good insurance role you have. Yeah, because I think it's important for people to know that the scholarly record has to be findable and archived. Now, I noticed some publishers and journal instructions actually require authors to add all the DOIs to the reference list to help the readers find them, find the sources. In that case, the DOI is itself a URL with doi.org. What does that mean?
So we used to, and you'll see this in some reference lists, you'll see just the DOI registered as the number. But more recently, as part of our display guidelines, we've asked our members to display the DOI as a URL. So starting doi.org / and then the DOI. And the doi.org is basically kind of the referrer or the lookup tool. And once you append a DOI to that, it just works like a URL. You can click on that and it will look up the information and take you to the research related to that DOI. So we just wanted to make sure that it functions as easily as possible for researchers.
I think that's really useful, especially in PDFs, where the links will still work in a PDF. Now, for authors who are trying to make their reference lists, is there some way they can look up DOIs of the articles that they're citing?
Yeah, there are a lot of sort of reference or bibliographic management and helper tools that use the Crossref metadata to help authors look up DOIs. Things like EndNote, Zotero, which I've used quite a lot. We also have, our own sort of free search tool at Crossref, so the authors can paste in a list of their references and we'll return those with the DOIs in place. So the majority of reference management tools that authors use should be able to help look up the DOIs of articles so that you don't have to do it on a case-by-case basis, which is pretty painful.
Now, some journals allow green open access, where they give permission to authors to share the author's accepted manuscript, which is after peer review revision and article acceptance, but before editing. Does the author's accepted manuscript get a DOI? And what happens when the journal publishes the final version of record? Does that get a different DOI?
For Crossref's purposes, we tend to use the DOI and think about it in the context of citation. So if I was going to say the author's accepted manuscript, the publisher often gives permission for that to be posted in maybe an institutional or a subject-specific repository. So in that case, I would want to cite that manuscript using a different reference than I would to the published version on the publisher website. So in those instances, because the author's accepted manuscript tends to live somewhere else, then it would have a different DOI to the one that the publisher registers, just because you'd want to make that distinction whenever you're citing that in your research.
Yeah, I think there's also the issue of later notices, like correction notices or retraction notices or addenda. Do those have DOIs? And then how do they link back to the main article?
It is really interesting because there's more research being published than ever before. And if something is corrected or retracted, it's really important for that information to flow through the system so that anyone can tell if research they're reading has had important changes made to it. We have a service called Crossmark, which allows publishers to register information on corrections and retractions in the article metadata. And that can then feed through into things like reference management systems or anyone who uses the Crossref metadata. So making information and corrections and retractions machine readable should make it easier down the line for people to identify if changes have been made to the work. It's not foolproof at the moment. Publishers need to participate in that. And things like authors' accepted manuscripts, it can be trickier to track those down. But I think as a community, we need to make efforts to do this so that people don't waste valuable time using research that, that has issues or isn't a suitable source for them to build on.
Yeah, I've seen that. It's a circle with a red little flag mark, the Crossmark logo. So whenever that's there, people can click on it and it's an active program that searches for new things, is it?
Yeah, exactly.
Can other things have DOIs, like preprints, which are the manuscript drafts that authors can upload to platforms like bioRxiv and medRxiv?
We brought in the capacity for preprint servers to register DOIs for preprints. I think that was back in 2016. And that was due to demand from people like bioRxiv, who are already providing DOIs for their journal content. So yes, preprints can have DOIs and they can be connected to the publisher version in the metadata. And again, we've seen this during the current pandemic when there's been such a rush to get research out there. People want to see it, they want to cite it, and it seemed beneficial for the research community to be able to have identifiers for preprints so that they can be disseminated and so that they can be cited in a different way to the published research.
Do you help authors tell the preprint platform to link preprints to their final published papers?
It's a mixture of things. If we do some matching, and it's pretty rough matching in our system, and if we see something that has a similar title or a similar author list to a preprint that's registered with us, then we'll send the preprint server an email to say, look, we found something that looks like it might be a published version of that work, and encourage them to make those links in the metadata if one exists. And I know the majority of preprint servers that we work with, they supplement that with their own processes for trying to find links between the preprint and the published article, asking the author, doing various searches. But we do have a method whereby we notify them to help them make those links.
Does the DOI registration service cost publishers who are Crossref members?
So there's an annual membership fee for a publisher to join Crossref, and it's based on their publishing revenue or income. And then they pay per DOI. So broadly speaking, it's $1 per DOI that's paid for by the publisher. It said the researcher never has to pay for those. We do charge additional charges for some of our services, similarity check, which we'll talk about in a second. And we used to charge for Crossmark, but we removed those charges because, as we were saying, retraction information is really important. So we didn't want the cost of participating to be a barrier to publishers doing so.
Oh, wow. Oh, I didn't know that. That's very kind of you. That's really important that Crossmark is like a service, a public service. Oh, that's really good. Now, to clarify, Crossref is a registry rather than an indexing service. I've sometimes seen journal websites say that they are indexed in Crossref.
And I think it's an easy kind of mistake to make. As you say, Trevor, we're a registry because publishers and our members, which also include folks like funders, preprint servers, they come to us and they register the content with us and we make it available. We're not kind of going out and indexing content in the same way as maybe abstract and indexing databases might do so. But I can see how people confuse that.
Okay. Now, DOIs should help researchers get credit for things like articles and books and preprints. But there's other things that can have DOIs, like data sets and conference papers and even peer review reports.
Yeah, that's something that we work with our members to try to, figure that out. is the easiest way to say it. So the reason that we have preprints registered with us is that our members came and said, look, we're publishing these. It seems suitable that these have identifiers. So let's do that. Similarly, book chapters, so that if you've written a chapter of a book, you can get credit for that. And then outside Crossref, there are other DOI registration agencies. So DataCite, who register DOIs predominantly for data, but also for things like software. And equally, there's a DOI registration agency who registers DOIs for films and the movie industry. So just because you see that something has a DOI doesn't necessarily mean it's a Crossref DOI.
Now, if something has a DOI, then authors can get professional credit for it, and it's citable. Does Crossref have other formal relationships with initiatives like Altmetrics, ORCID Research Identifiers, and Credit Contributor Roles Taxonomy?
We have links to lots of different sort of industry initiatives. So I would say that a lot of Altmetrics services use the Crossref metadata because DOIs they're a means to uniquely identify a piece of content. So if you want to assign altmetric data to something, you need to know what that thing is. We work a lot with ORCID. Crossref initially kind of half incubated ORCID. And when we see an author's ORCID in the metadata, what we do is we can push that to the author and they can let us know if they want to add that directly to their ORCID record or not. So the aim is to kind of save them time and effort. And equally, we'll also start to accept the credit taxonomy as part of the metadata that we collect at Crossref. That will be in the next few months. And again, that will mean that the information is machine readable across publishers, which again should just help authors and contributors to a paper be recognised for the work that they're doing.
Would you recommend authors get a DOI for other things they produce, like lay summaries, blogs, conference posters, or slides? I saw that the F1000 platform accepts posters and slides.
Like you, I've definitely seen more. The word that I want to use is informal. I don't really mean that, but different types of content that researchers are using to share their results get DOIs. There's a repository called Zenodo, which supports a lot of those content types. So even if it's something that maybe isn't going to be sort of formally published in a journal or as a book or as a conference proceeding, there are still sort of platforms and repositories that will support the author getting a DOI for those so that they can add those into their record.
Now, if anything digital can have a DOI, it should help in finding and citing it in the future, but it's nothing to do with published or peer-reviewed status because we said preprints can have DOIs.
Yeah, and there's exactly. And I think, as I said, as more types of research need to be shared over time, as you said, the really, the rapid growth of preprints, etc. A DOI doesn't mean published. It doesn't mean peer-reviewed. Although I have seen people, use those as a kind of a quality stamp, but unfortunately, it's not as easy as that. It's just an identifier for the piece of content, and it doesn't sort of confer a quality stamp on it.
Yeah, that brings me to a touchy topic. So can predatory journals, in theory, also apply for DOIs and metadata registration?
Yeah, and it's something that I think that, that publications that have been labelled as predatory, it's a really tricky problem kind of across the industry. From the Crossref perspective, we have terms that our members that we need them to stick to, and that includes properly representing who they are and who the publisher is. That said, if a new journal applies to Crossref, we won't necessarily know what their publishing practices are, and there's an extent to which it's out of our remit to check the quality of the content or the business practices of our members. Although in specific cases where there have been court rulings against members, we have removed them. But it's something it's a little broader than the remit of what Crossref does at the moment. As I said, there are also other DOI registration agencies. So It might be that a journal has a DOI, but it might not even be a Crossref DOI. So unfortunately, it is a tricky problem to solve, and we're not quite there with that as an industry yet.
That's really interesting, but also a good warning for authors. So a journal isn't trustworthy just because it has DOIs, and it might not even be a Crossref DOI. So they really do have to do their homework and check any target journals. And of course, there's Think, Check, Submit website for them to use the checklist to judge journal trustworthiness. Now, you said there's other groups that supply DOIs. Do you all talk to each other?
Yes, we do. I was on a call with one of the other DOI registration agencies this morning because we work closely together, and the International DOI Foundation, who I mentioned earlier, all of the registration agencies meet up at their at the IDF's board meetings and things like that to try to address common problems and in areas where there's overlap. So some organizations are members of Crossref for their journals and DataCite for their data. So we all end up talking to each other because it's a small world and we all sit under the umbrella of the IDF.
Another thing that Crossref does is provide a text matching service based on AsiaEit called Similarity Check, which used to be called Crosscheck. Is that service paid for by publishers, and how does it work?
Yes, it's an additional service that our members can subscribe to. So there are a couple of steps to participating. They do pay an annual membership fee for the service, and then a small fee starting at 75 cents for each article that they want to run through the service and check. The other side is that they need to let the content that they published be indexed in the AsiaEit database so that they and other publishers who participate in the service can check their content against it. Because if you want to check research and scholarly content, the best thing to check that against is other research and scholarly content to make sure that you're not seeing any potential issues with plagiarism.
Also, the content sources that it matches, that it compares against, is AsiaEit's database.
Yes, so it's the content from Crossref members. It's also content from specific databases, like offline databases that are maintained by companies like Gale and EBSCO. But it's also just, there are billions of content items that the AsiaEit have also indexed basically from the internet at large, and that's growing all the time. So it's a very comprehensive database, but with a weighting towards that scholarly content that we're trying to check against.
I know that when editors use it, it gives them a similarity check report, and it's similar to what authors can use in their own institutions. There's a Turnitin version. I always hear authors ask, what percentage overlap is allowed before it's called plagiarism?
If we could answer that question, we could all go home tomorrow. It's so tempting, and I've seen this on the journal side and the publisher side, it's very tempting to just want to look at, so say a report comes back and it says 75%. It's easy to jump to conclusions based on that number. But we were talking earlier about, authors going and, being able to post their accepted manuscript on their own website or in an institutional repository. So you could see big overlaps in text happening there for totally valid reasons. Preprints are another one. So the rule of thumb is that although it takes longer, it's always worth digging into the report, seeing what the matches are and where they're being matched to, so that an editor can make an informed decision on whether or not there are problems with the text that's being reproduced in the article.
Oh, okay, so does the report actually identify what source has been copied?
Yes, you can click on what's called full source view, and that will show you the full text of the item that's being copied. And that's even if even if the full text is paywalled on the publisher site. But you can also link through to the publisher website. I say publisher website, it could be to a preprint server a repository, the author website, so you can check where the text has come from, if it's another journal or if it's something else. And again, that's really important in helping the editors make decisions in terms of where the text has come from and if the matching is problematic or not.
In the future, what Crossref developments will there be in this age of open research, open science, data sharing, and data and text mining?
We always have lots of things going on because we work with over, I think, 16,000 members around the world. We've definitely seen interest from our members in giving us additional metadata. So there are fields with things like the affiliations of the authors and abstracts, which traditionally we haven't collected a lot of, but there's more interest in doing that so that the Crossref metadata, which is openly available, can be used for people doing research into research or to try to streamline reporting on behalf of institutions and to be able to look at other ways that research is connected and being used in the wider ecosystem. So we want to make sure that that information is openly available for use by the research community.
Yeah, right. That's going to be really useful. Now, before we go, I'd like to quickly change direction a bit and ask you how you became interested in metadata and how you joined Crossref.
I came to Crossref because I used to work for one of our members, Taylor and Francis, and Crossref has various committees with our members that inform direction of our services. So I was on what was then the cross-check committee and then the similarity check committee. And I heard about it and started working with Crossref from there. And then a job came up to run that committee and to run that service. And I thought, well, that seems like a good fit. And it's so interesting working with the global publishing community and see that sort of grow and progress over time. So it sort of started with something small and then got a lot wider than that.
Wow. And okay, so finally, what's your goal for your role in Crossref in member and community outreach?
I think that we want to continue to make it easy for publishers to work with us and to participate in Crossref services. And that also involves improving how we work globally. So supporting different languages, helping to find organizations in different countries who can support Crossref members, and just generally stay engaged with the community so that when there's sort of new ideas and areas of research and things that we could help with, so that we know about those as early as possible.
Yeah, I think it's a really important organization worldwide, and I wish you luck in getting more outreach around the world. And listeners can find out more at crossref.org, CROSSREF.org. So, okay, Rachel, thank you for all your insights and for being our podcast guest today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Trevor. Great to speak to you.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the AsiaEdit et al. Podcast. For more publishing advice, visit AsiaEdit.com. I'm Trevor Lane, and I hope you tune in next time for more expert publishing tips.